Hello, I'm Paul Fanlon, editor and publisher of the Capital Times, and I'd like to welcome you to this Cap Times Idea Fest session about what's next for conservatism in Wisconsin. This is our fourth annual event, but the first that we are presenting virtually. Our theme this year is 2020 Changes Everything. Given the local and regional impact of COVID-19, the resulting economic damage, and the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement, there's a lot to talk about. And we think this year's lineup is our best yet. We believe Idea Fest has grown into a signature event on the Madison calendar. It is also an important showcase for the Capital Times, our locally owned and century-old journalism brand. If you're not already, we hope you'll consider becoming a Cap Times member. Learn more at membership.captimes.com. I'd like to thank the Burrish Group at UBS, which is the presenting sponsor of Idea Fest and has been with us since the start. Andy Burrish and Jason Moss have built their asset management firm's stellar reputation by effective investing for Madisonians, but also for investing in Madison. Their generous support of Idea Fest is but one example of their community commitment. This session features Charlie Sykes, editor-at-large at the Bulwark and a noted national political commentator with deep roots in Wisconsin. He will be joined by Brian Reisinger, the president of Platform Communications, as well as a conservative writer and former top campaign aide to Scott Walker and Ron Johnson. They'll be talking about the direction of conservatism in Wisconsin after this fall's elections. The Burrish Group is the sponsor of this session and joins the Capital Times in a commitment to presenting ideological diversity at Idea Fest. Again, thank you and welcome.
Hi, welcome to Cap Times Idea Fest. I'm Katelyn Ferral, the Cap Times investigative reporter, and I'm here today doing a panel about the future of the conservative movement and the Republican Party. And I have two great guests with me today. We have Charlie Sykes joining us from Mequon, and we also have Brian Reisinger in the studio here. So Charlie Sykes is a former conservative talk show host in Wisconsin. He's the founder and editor-at-large of The Bulwark, a center-right anti-Trump news site. He's also written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and he is also the author of 9 books, including his most recent, How the Right Lost Its Mind. That one was released in 2017. We also have Brian Reisinger. He's a conservative writer and public affairs professional. He began his career as a newspaper reporter, and he's now based in Madison. His political work first began as a top aide to U.S. Senator Ron Johnson and Lamar Alexander. He also worked with Governor Scott Walker, and he also writes about the Midwest in publications ranging from the National Review to Badger Sportsman magazine. So today I'm going to be asking questions of each of them and then some general questions, and we're hoping to have a good, lively discussion about where the party is going. So Brian, I wanted to start with you. You recently wrote a piece for the National Review specifically looking at Wisconsin's Republican Party, and you spoke about how it's been remarkably unified and has had a lot of success in its grassroots. But you also talked about some organizers that we probably don't really hear too much about. You cited one, Orlando Owens, who's an activist in the Black community, and some of the sentiments there about the GOP really needing to grow its tent in order to expand. Some on the left or maybe others on the right would say that the party maybe has struggled in doing that over the last few years, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that and how you see that the party is growing its tent.
Well, it kind of depends upon how you define growing the tent. We should be growing it in any and all directions because we should be welcoming everybody into our political movement on the conservative side if we want to grow it. There have been some real successes on the conservative side of that, despite what you do hear in the media and despite the charges from the left. Here in Wisconsin, there's been a massive growth in the rural coalition in Wisconsin. There have been people who've never been engaged in politics or who used to be Democrats who have voted Republican, not only in 2016 for President Trump, but in the years prior to that, especially during the recall and times like that. So there's been a deepening and a broadening of the rural coalition. That's really brought in a lot of independent voters and been a remarkable growing of the tent. It also, the unity here in Wisconsin showed itself in terms of how Wisconsin conservatives were able to unite the Tea Party and the conservative grassroots, frankly, with a wide swath of swing voters when you consider how closely divided Wisconsin really is. So there's been a lot of success. There are certainly challenges. Right now, there's a challenge in the suburbs that didn't traditionally exist. Traditionally, we did well with the type of suburban women who are a challenge for Republicans right now. We can win those people back. We need to be winning those people back in order, if Republicans want to win in 2020. But there's also, new people we need to bring into the tent. And what the conservative movement needs to do is find a surging population that it can merge with some of this existing base. So whether it's young voters, whether it's ways to make inroads with Black and Hispanic voters, those things need to happen. And it is a challenge for the conservative movement long term, in the sense that both parties and all political movements have challenges. If you're not growing, you're dying. And so you need to be doing those things.
Charlie, do you have any thoughts on that question and or his response?
Well, I have many thoughts about that. In fact, I'm old enough to remember when Wisconsin's own Reince Priebus was chairman of the Republican National Committee. And after the 2012 election, he commissioned something called the autopsy, which was looking at how to grow the Republican Party, what went wrong. And it essentially said, we can't continue to alienate women, young people, Hispanics, African Americans, if we want to grow. And what the Republican Party then proceeded to do over the next 4 years is do the exact opposite of everything in the autopsy. So yes, the Republican Party has grown in rural areas, but there's a reason, as Brian points out, why Republicans are struggling in the suburbs. It's because they have gone all in with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has been repellent to women for a variety of reasons, including his attitude toward women and his approach to them. I think that he's also going to set back any efforts that the Republican Party has made in the African-American community and certainly the Hispanic community. I mean, just last week, you might have read about what happened in Waukesha County, crucial Waukesha County. The Waukesha County GOP women hosted a big dollar fundraiser attended by many prominent Republican elected officials. And their keynote speaker was Michelle Malkin, who is one of the most notorious alt-right white nationalist figures in the country, who in fact was fired by the Young America's Foundation because she has defended a Holocaust denier. And she led this group of Republicans in Waukesha County in a standing ovation for Kyle Rittenhouse, who's the 17-year-old boy who crossed state lines and shot 3 people, killing 2 in Kenosha. So I would suggest that this is not a strategy and a message that is going to grow the tent. And it is certainly not going to win over the suburbs. And if, in fact, the conservative movement and the Republican Party is serious about attracting African Americans, I think they ought to rethink what some of their leaders are doing and saying right now.
More to that?
No, I think that, it's just important to remember that there's a lot of ways to define the tent. And, I don't think that the only way to grow them is by going to the voters that people are talking about. I think that, it's important to note that with the autopsy after the 2012 loss that Reince and others oversaw, I don't think it's true that we did everything exact opposite from the Republican standpoint. Certainly from the standpoint of where some of the focus lied and where some of the voting, the increase in the vote share came from, it was different. But in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the investment that it takes to win, those things were done. And so, deepening and broadening your coalition among rural voters is nothing to sneeze at. It's important. It's difficult. The Democrats would love to be deepening and broadening their coalition with rural voters, but they've completely lost touch with them. So that's important.
So,
well, we had to at least say the name Donald Trump, should we, Brian? Yes, there were certain things that were done in the mechanics, but there's a reason why Republican women in the suburbs are turning away from the Republican Party. There's a reason why this is happening. And it has something to do with the values that the Republican Party has embraced. Look, I think that, and I'm sorry to get a little bit ahead, but Wisconsin's Republican Party has a fascinating history, and I understand your revisionist history, Brian. But part of this history was that Paul Ryan was at one time, whatever you think about what he did recently, was really the face of the future of the Republican Party, who wanted to be more inclusive, who was reaching out to the central cities in the final years of his career. Was in favor of free markets, was open to serious immigration reform, took seriously the need to make the Republican Party, I think, more inclusive. And yet in 2016, the Republican Party chose to reject Paul Ryan and go with Donald Trump. And you think about these two visions of the party. One that I thought was represented by the Wisconsin conservative movement and the Republican Party, and the others by Donald Trump. And what's happened now is the Republican Party in Wisconsin has in fact made itself over to Donald Trump. He's a wholly owned subsidiary of Trumpism. And I think that you're going to see in November the price that they're going to pay in the suburbs, in the central city, and in other places for doing that. I think you're going to see this in the gender gap. I think you're going to see this among young voters. And I think you're going to see it among minorities. And I think the damage is going to take a very, very long time to fix.
One question I had, and Charlie, I wanted to first direct this one to you, is to get your thoughts. I don't know if you're familiar with it or have read it, but Stuart Stevens, a longtime GOP operative, wrote a book that was published earlier this year. It was All a Lie, largely with the thesis that the conservative ideology over the last 50 years or so was a lie, and that the departure we've seen from some folks in the GOP breaking from Trump, and the seeming break with the way that conservatives position themselves over the years isn't really a new thing, and that it's been a slow march towards that. How do you view the premise of that book, and also your role in contributing to and developing, the conservative movement in Wisconsin, and the role that that's played nationally? And I'm curious too, just given your role now and the evolution that you've had, if it's been difficult at times to kind of maintain credibility, or if have gotten criticized because of the about face that you've had when it comes to the way the movement worked when you were an integral part of that for so long.
Okay, well, there's a lot there, but I think you're asking the crucial question. Did the Republican Party go crazy, or was it always crazy? Look, I should disclose Stuart Stevens is a good friend of mine, and he has been on my podcast several times, and we've talked about this in depth, and we've really gone back and forth on this. And I think that his premise is that it was all a lie. The conservatives never believed these things. Is true and false at the same time. It depends what you mean. And I don't want to get too deep into this, but you need to separate out the conservative movement from the elected Republican officials, or perhaps the ideas of conservatism as developed in think tanks, sponsored by people like the Bradley Foundation, versus what the actual base was really believing. So there were a lot of conservatives who were, deeply serious about fiscal responsibility, fiscal conservatism, who would have been horrified at $1 trillion a year deficits, who would have been horrified by some of the things that have happened. But I also think that it's true that many of the elected officials use those issues as convenient excuses. And what you saw was how quickly they were willing to abandon them. The other question is, what did we ignore? What did we look the other way? Did we not push back enough on the crackpots, on the racists, on the extremists out there? Did we somehow take them for granted? Did we exploit all of that? Did we add to the sense of tribalization where ultimately ideas don't matter? I mean, the moment we're at right now is that the Republican Party, which once was the party of ideas, I think, or could have been, is now basically a cult of personality. So Donald Trump has a lot of responsibility for that. But to go to your point, I think that what Stuart Stevens says, and I agree with, this was obviously a pre-existing condition as well. There was a dysfunction as well. And we could unpack them issue by issue by issue. But during the 1980s, I think that there were a lot of people who said things that sounded good, but they might have been this thin layer. I guess part of it is the intellectual tradition of conservatism was like this thin crust over this molten base of the actual electorate. And maybe Donald Trump understood that better than some of the conservative intellectuals who really thought that the conservative movement was about a specific set of ideas.
Well, one thing I was curious about is, in the book, Stevens is pretty unabashed about the fact that he played a central role and was, beyond complicit in what he now decries. And how do you view your role in that, given that you agree with his premise there?
Well, I agree with some of his premise there, as I said. I mean, on the issues of, when we talked about inner city school choice, or about taxes, or about a variety of these other issues, I don't really have that much that regret. But the question is, though, did we push back on the darker edges of the conservative movement? Should we have done more about the birthers, the conspiracy theories? Should we have confronted the issue of race more honestly? And I have to say, I do think about this all the time. To what extent did we contribute? Look, talk radio was certainly part of this story. There's no way to tell the story of what happened in Wisconsin without talking about conservative talk radio. And so to that extent, did I contribute to it? Yes. I thought for a long time that I was providing the other side of the story. In fact, I might have been contributing to this creation of this alternative reality silo that has done so much to polarize and tribalize us. So I think that we need to engage in a lot of introspection. Unfortunately, and this is part of the problem with the conservative movement right now, if Donald Trump is reelected, conservatives will just simply say, we're going to keep doing what we're doing, as opposed to asking themselves these really hard questions. How did a movement that said character counts join itself at the hip with Donald Trump? How did a movement that rallied around Ronald Reagan when he stared down the Soviets, how did they become a wholly owned subsidiary of a guy who's basically the handmaiden for Vladimir Putin? How did this happen to the conservative movement? And how did we get on the wrong side of the issues of racial justice? I think that this is something that some of us, I think, in the Trump skeptical movement have been wrestling with. But there's going to be a tremendous reckoning after Trump for the rest of the conservative movement to ask themselves these questions.
Brian, what are your thoughts on one of those things?
Parties are always growing and contracting and shifting and evolving and changing. And I think that sometimes we get locked into this thinking that things are static and that the party as it is now is exactly the way that people from the outside look at it and exactly the way that they define it through the prism of President Trump in this case or whatever it might be. The picture is always more complicated than that, and parties are always evolving and changing. Here in Wisconsin, we've got some great female candidates running in the suburbs. We've got Jessie Rodriguez, who's been elected in, a district that isn't always a given. We've got Bonnie Lee running against Robin Vining, just to name a couple of assembly candidates who I think represent some of the best of our party. So there's a lot more to the party and a lot more to the conservative movement than Donald Trump, despite what you hear from Washington, despite what you hear from the outside. And the party is always evolving and changing. And I think that's important. I think one of the biggest problems, I kind of agree with Charlie here, where I think some of that premise is right, some of it's wrong. I think the parts that I would say are right are that we unfortunately have a political system, and it's infected with human nature, which is the way that people are on both sides of the aisle, of people who aren't necessarily authentic. I mean, that book is written by someone, and I'm not disparaging him personally because I don't know him, but that book was written by someone who's involved in a campaign where another of the head people on that campaign said that really a candidate is like an Etch-a-Sketch. So in the primary, you sketch out as conservative of a person as you can, and then you take Mitt Romney and you shake him like an Etch-a-Sketch, and then in the general election you draw a whole new sketch. That's not the way that campaigns should work. That's not the way that winning people over should work. You should be talking about your ideals. That's where I do think Wisconsin is different, and I would hope that Charlie would still agree that we have had some people in our recent history who have been authentic, who have ran on their ideals, who've been true to their convictions, and were able to energize our base, but also able to win over swing voters by doing what they said they were going to do. I think those things are important. I think those things are a reality, and I think those are things that can still emerge with this party. Whether President Trump wins in 2020 and the race to define the party in 2024 is where things go, or whether he doesn't win and the race to figure out how to move forward from that, whichever of those eventualities occurs, the party is going to do what political parties do, which is always grow and evolve. The most important thing that we can do is have people and ideas who are authentic, who are talking about what they really believe in, and who are, hopefully being true to those ideals. And I would agree that there are people who have held true to it and who haven't. And I think that's a shame. But again, our politics are infected by human nature, and that's just the way that it goes sometimes.
So would you say that Trump is a liability to the type of conservative politics that Wisconsin is emblematic of?
I don't think so. I think that things are more complicated. I'm sure that Charlie disagrees on that. But, the fact of the matter is, if you look at the way that President Trump has governed, in some ways, and actually in many ways, in some of the biggest ways, he's governed as a traditional conservative. Historic tax cuts, deregulation that unleashed our economy, rebuilding the military, reforming the judicial system with judges who are, concerned about the Constitution. By the way, those judges don't always rule in favor of the Trump administration. Those are a lot of really big picture accomplishments that reflect conservative values. In other ways, perhaps the president is unconventional, of course, but there are some real conservative values that have been put in place there. So political movements, parties, candidates are always going to be imperfect, and that's just the way that it is.
I guess this was somewhat touched on, but I wondered what you all thought about whether we would see another version of the center-right party or a new center-right party emerging from the ashes of the GOP if they lose this year, and what might it take to have a new conservative party take root? Maybe if you want to start with that one, Charlie, and then we can go to Brian.
Well, I agree with Brian that the political parties are always evolving, but they're not always evolving and growing. Sometimes they're evolving and shrinking. Sometimes they're evolving and become extinct, like the Whigs back in the 19th century. The Republican Party, at one time used to get 40% of the African American vote, 40% of the Hispanic vote, and they've evolved to a point where I think that they're going to not see that for another generation. I remember when Republicans were dominant in the state of California until they decided to go all in on anti-immigrant politics, and now California is a one-party Democratic state. So yes, there is an evolution because these are choices that parties make. But to your question about a new party, let me just back up. I think there's a tremendous appetite for stepping away from the extremes. One of the things that I've learned at the Bulwark is that, in fact, there is a market for center-right, center-left dialogue, that people actually do want to talk about the future of the country, that there is a coalition of the decent that don't think things like decency are being unconventional, or that a culture of corruption is unconventional. Donald Trump poses a much greater challenge to the country. And I think that when you step back from this right-left divide, I think you do find a lot of people of goodwill who do want to work together. And that's been a positive thing. Actually, it's been very liberating to get out of the tribe, to get off the team, to be able to think I don't have to accept everything that this party is saying. So on paper, I think that there's room for centrism, whether it's center-right or center-left. But the reality is it's very hard to break the two-party hold. And I think it'd be very damaging if you had one political party that loses its mind, that becomes either overwhelmed by the conspiracy theories or unable to stand up against them. And part of this is, for the Republicans, it's not just that they've embraced bad ideas. It's that they've chosen not to stand against bad ideas. This is one of those cases where the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passion and intensity. And Wisconsin is such an example of that, because I think that we did, I think, have the possibility of being a third way, but that's not going to happen. So I don't know what's going to happen. People have asked me, what do you think the future of the Republican Party is going to be? And my answer is, I don't know. I think the house is on fire right now. Let's put out the fire. We'll worry about the redecorating later. I would say this. I don't think that the Republican Party snaps back to sanity the moment Donald Trump leaves. I think that Trumpism is too deep within the party. I think conservatism, unfortunately, has allowed itself to become dumber and crueler than it was before, and more divorced from reality. And I think you see that with the defenses of Trump, which again are not irrelevant and are going to stick with the party. So I think this is going to be a fight that's going to last for a very, very long time. But I think the real question is whether the Republican Party can remain a viable national party with the demographic changes in this country if it continues to make the kind of choices it's been making.
Well, I think you can't build a party without people. And the fact of the matter is that about half the country supports President Trump. And whatever happens in this election, there's a very intense portion of the Republican Party that supports President Trump. And they're not all deplorables. In fact, most are good people. Many of them are from places like where I'm from, in rural Sauk County, places like where Charlie's from. These are good people who care about their country, who care about their community, who care about some of the things President Trump has done. They like the way he has shaken things up. And just because they support someone like President Trump doesn't mean that they're not worth having in the party going forward and in whatever movement emerges. I don't think the House is on fire. I don't think that the party is dying. I think that it is changing, and you're constantly adding rooms to a house, if that's the metaphor that we want to use for a political party.
But what might you say to the person, the Wisconsin person that in many ways, is on board with what conservative values and those types of policy issues, and yet are deeply troubled by the rhetoric of President Trump, the way it's been documented, the way that he has treated women in the past, and a litany of things that he has said and documented lies that he's told. As Charlie had mentioned too, there's so much rhetoric about how character counts when the way that we talk about President Reagan, for example, as the movement has in the past. What might you say to folks that would otherwise be really definitely voting Republican, and yet the very leader of the party, they're just deeply troubled by?
Well, policy does matter, and the policy accomplishments of the Trump administration are something that a lot of Republicans, a lot of genuine conservatives, even if they don't agree with all parts of it, do see a lot of good in and a lot of importance in. And there's also just how far left the Democrat Party in this country has gone. And that is a real consideration for people, whether they like the president or not. The fact that the policy outcomes do matter, and that there are a lot of things that conservatives can find in the Trump administration to like. As far as to the character issue, I think that unfortunately, we have had a history for so long where character was sort of held up as something that people cared about in politics, but it actually wasn't really practiced. If you go back to the Clinton administration, the Clinton years, a lot of that stuff is coming home to roost. The Democrats really don't have room to talk. Nobody has room to talk. And so we all just sort of need to move on from that a little bit. And we should be picking leaders who reflect our values, both in terms of policy and in terms of character, absolutely. And
Okay.
Donald Trump does that. Well, Donald Trump does that for some people, and for others he doesn't, obviously. There's also a lot of noise and a lot of stuff that I think people on the right consider to be just sort of not an accurate lens of what's going on. And there's a lot of stuff where people are frustrated with both sides to the point that they don't really believe what they hear, and it's kind of hard to blame them for that.
Well, I'm not prepared to move on from the question of character and honesty and decency and empathy. I'm not prepared to move on from that. I'm not prepared to move on from a president whose corruption is pretty much all the way down. We could spend some time talking about what this president is doing to the constitutional order, what Donald Trump is doing to the rule of law, the kind of grifting and grafting that we see on a regular basis. But this is Donald Trump. This is who he was before he became president. He was a con man and a serial liar even before that. And it was a shock to me to listen to conservatives basically say, yeah, well, all right, but at least he's not the other guy. And this is part of the whataboutism. I was consistent in the 1990s about Bill Clinton and the character issue, but it's been interesting to me watching the complete flip-flop of conservatives, including conservatives in Wisconsin on this question, because I fundamentally do think that character and honesty matters. We talk a lot about these constitutional norms, or the norms that are being broken. One of the things we've discovered about our system is that our democracy, our constitutional republic, is essentially an honor system. We don't have hard and fast rules that protect, for example, us from a president who will abuse his power, because the honor system assumes that the man or woman in the Oval Office is going to be an honorable person. And I think we used to all agree on that. So no, Brian, I'm not prepared to move past that particular issue. And one would hope that at some point this is where, in this Venn diagram of things we disagree about, we may disagree on politics. I may disagree with Joe Biden on what should the marginal tax rate be. I'm going to disagree with him. I might disagree with Joe Biden on 8 out of 10 issues. But fundamentally, and I guess this is where I've come down, and I've changed my mind on this. I used to think that politics was all about policy. Now I think it's about value. And so I can disagree with you on 6 or 8 out of 10 issues. But if you are a decent, honorable, honest, empathetic human being, we can do business. As opposed to this new culture, which is, it doesn't matter as long as I get what I want in terms of tax codes or judges, I'm willing to look the other way for all of it. The racism, the xenophobia, the sexism, the self-dealing, the kleptocracy. This is like a cancer on the political system.
Well, I think that, I'll disagree from the standpoint of I don't think that it ever was that politics was really all about policy, and I don't think it's now that it's all about values. It's always been about both. And when I talk about moving on, I'm not talking about turning a blind eye and just sort of forgetting about things and floating away like nothing is going wrong. I'm talking about this country having an honest conversation about what both sides and all kinds of people in all aspects of the liberal and conservative movements have done to sow sort of the distrust and the frustration that people have, to the point that maybe they don't care about things that they might have at one time. And I think that that's something that this country has to sort of confront and deal with. But we also can't just tag one side as owning all of the lack of virtue in this country, and then the other side is the white knights. It's just not the way that it works. It's not the reality. I do think that something that Charlie said that's important is the desire for people. I guess what I'll put it for spin on it is to get things done. I don't know necessarily if I'd use the term centrism, but I think there is definitely a desire amongst people on both sides, including, by the way, some of the most extreme people on one side or the other. If you talk to them and really sit down and have a conversation that's outside of kind of the political abstract, talking to them about what they want out of their politics, they want something done. And centrism is maybe one way to get at that. I think that if both parties were to be in a position to understand that in order to get something done, you have to be able to make an agreement with someone without forcing them to compromise their own values, we'd make a lot of progress on that issue. That's a difficult thing to do right now, and I hope that we see more of that. So maybe there's a variation of a Venn diagram of agreement from that standpoint.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I did have a question here. I mean, speaking about how you're saying, politics was never purely about policy nor about character. I mean, to what degree is it now, and has it always really been about power and maintaining power? One cynical question I had for you guys is, why should anyone believe that party politics is about really anything other than maintaining that at this point? I think given, a lot of the partisanship and gamesmanship we see on both sides, there very well are members of the public that cynically believe that that's really what it's always been about.
I'm sure that there are people who are in public life sincerely with an agenda to make life better. I think people, many people get into politics because they care about their country, they care about their community, they want to make life better, and they understand what the challenges are. And I know that they're there. But right now, you do get the feeling that politics really is just simply about I win and you lose. And if I win, I'm going to ram through anything I want, and I'm going to humiliate you. And that one of the goals of my politics is to make you as upset and alienated as possible. And I think that temptation is dangerous for the country, because I think that one of the things that happened in our politics, and we were part of this here in Wisconsin as well, and I have to admit this, the whole idea that compromise was not necessarily a good thing. And I remember saying back in a decade or so ago, if not now, when? If you have the majority, shouldn't you push through what you want? But the problem is, and I think that's a mistake, whether it's done by Democrats or Republicans, because at that point then it is about power politics. It's not about, and politics is not about persuasion. It's about bludgeoning your opponent. What's the real tell, though, is watching the political parties completely switch positions on quote unquote principles or norms or rules, depending on whose ox is being gored. And that's sort of the giveaway, that you'll believe something as long as it's in your interest, but the moment that it might be inconvenient, you drop the value whatsoever. So this is one of the dangers for the future of our democracy and for what conservatives claim to want to protect. If people become so deeply cynical about the political process, if they don't think that it works, if they don't think that it's responsive, if they don't think that it's about anything other than the preservation of power, then, how invested are people going to be in this marvelous experiment that we've been undertaking?
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of that. What I would say is that politics has been about power not only since the beginning of the Republic, but all the way back to the beginning of civilization. The thing about it is, when we're at our best, it is also about doing the right thing along the way and trying to, some of the best politicians and some of the best public figures, some of the best leaders we've had in this country, whether it's Reagan or anybody else, found a way to do something that was the right thing to do, that they believed in, and that also was politically advantageous to them. And that's when we're at our best. And we're not always at our best. But there's no question that it's about power, and people should understand that. And I think also we kind of need to give a little bit more respect to the voters. They understand that. They get that. What they don't like about our political system is that it didn't feel like it was on the level for a very long time. There were people on the left and on the right who sort of said they were going to do something, and then they didn't do it. And I think that's something that here in Wisconsin has been a little bit different. I think there were a lot of people who would say that if they didn't like what Scott Walker was doing, they at least appreciated that he was doing something, he was taking action, he was doing what he said he was going to do. In fact, that was the recipe for how he won a lot of swing voters, even while being a hero to the right. And I think that there's room for that kind of thing, and hopefully we have more of it. I don't know, I'd like to believe that the glass is half full, so we'll see.
All right, we're going to take a quick break so we can hear from our sponsors, but we'll be right back.
Cap Times Idea Fest 2020 is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors. Presenting sponsor, the Burrish Group at UBS, a financial services firm with global access and a local focus to pursue what matters most for its clients. Major sponsors are HealthX Ventures, backing entrepreneurs who are creating value with digital health solutions. Exact Sciences, pursuing earlier detections and life-changing answers in the fight against cancer. Quartz, health plans built with you in mind. And Madison Gas and Electric, your community energy company whose goal is net zero carbon electricity by 2050. Co-sponsors are Epic Systems and the Godfrey Kahn Law Firm. Other sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Home Savings Bank, Unity Point Health Meritor, Cargo Coffee, and the Forward Theater Company. Media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal and Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Please consider becoming a Cap Times member. Learn more at membership.captimes.com.
Hello, and we are back with Charlie Sykes and Brian Reisinger talking about the Republican Party and the future of conservatism. I wanted to take this in what's probably going to be a sticky bit of a direction here and talking about the role of the media and an informed civil society. I'm sure Brian has a lot of thoughts on this one. I'll direct this to you first. You were a newspaper reporter once. I'm curious, how that experience has shaped you in the work that you do now, and what your thoughts are when it comes to the media's role in, fairly and accurately informing society, and Trump's attacks on the media as fake news and enemies of the people. Mm-hmm. What did you think about the people that you worked with in media? Did you feel that there was a vast left-wing conspiracy creating fake news?
Well, you're lucky because you're asking this sticky question to two former journalists. So what I'll say about this is I think there are a lot of really good people doing a very hard job in the media, having done it myself for 10 years before getting into politics and now some of the other things that I'm doing. It's a very difficult job, and there's a lot of really good people doing it. I think that one of the things that happens with the media is that they fall into some pretty easy traps that unfortunately end up creating what I think is legitimately ruled as a bias from the conservative standpoint. I think Charlie might agree with some aspects of that, even still today. For example, most journalists who cover politics think that everything that kind of is important is happening in the halls of government. And I agree there are a lot of really important things, but there aren't, when I was in journalism school, I'll give you an example, there weren't a lot of reporters who were saying, I want to be a business journalist. I want to cover earnings calls. I want to cover what's happening in corporate America. No, people want to cover politics. People want to cover what's going on in Washington, D.C., et cetera. I don't think journalism schools and I don't think newsrooms talk enough about some of the other important institutions outside of government where important things happen. The business community, the economy. I think, frankly, a lot of journalists have a difficult time writing about the economy in a way that reflects the reality of it, and therefore, from the conservative standpoint, the way that conservative policies would work. So there are a lot of those. That's not the only thing, but they're just examples that I think there are structural things that make it more difficult sometimes for the media to fully and in a comprehensive and nuanced way, which is already hard to do because you have constrained time and space and resources and attention spans. But it makes it even harder for the media to properly cover things from a standpoint of conservatives reading it and saying, hey, yeah, you know what, I can see that they're trying to sort of articulate both sides or all sides of a discussion. So there are things like that. There's other structural things. I'm sure Charlie in his years in journalism, which I think was probably more years than mine, he probably has more and better examples of that, but that's one. I think what's happening now is that you take that difficult framework and some of the pitfalls that the media easily and sort of unfortunately falls into, And you put it in the Trump era where the president, one of his tactics, and it's something that a lot of supporters and a lot of conservatives cheer, is frankly to kind of gig the media, troll the media, get a reaction out of the media. That's what I chalk most of that stuff up to. The reality is that, President Trump is a pretty accessible president from the standpoint of he takes questions, he's out there. That's not something he necessarily gets credit for. I don't expect the media to give him a ton of credit for it. I'll acknowledge he's pretty hostile toward the media and that, it's a different posture, perhaps. But, I think that there is so much of this that is basically chalked up to trying to get a strong reaction out of the left, which he always gets, and a strong reaction out of the media, which he always gets. And that feeds the perception amongst some people who look at things and they don't necessarily think things are on the level. I don't think it's right to think that it's nefarious necessarily from my standpoint. I haven't experienced that. Maybe others have. I can't speak for others. But I do think that there are traps the media falls into, and I think right now in the Trump era, you're walking across a minefield with booby traps and tripwires all over the place, and the media is frankly falling on its face more days than not.
You have thoughts on that, Charlie? And I'm curious from your perspective now founding your own, media organization as well.
Well, I was going to say the first half of Brian's answer that I agreed with everything he said about sort of the structural problems of the media. And let me just throw something out here that, look, of course, there is a bias towards, in political coverage to government. And I do think sometimes it does show up in the publications that to see people who live in rural areas as sort of aliens, like, what is this Catholic Church thing? What do they really believe? How do businesses actually operate? That's a legitimate point. It's also a legitimate point to say that there's been a long tradition of bias in the media, and unfortunately, I don't think the journalism has confronted it. I think that, and as somebody who's been a newspaper reporter and worked in TV and magazines, I think part of the problem is sort of the groupthink, is that a lot of reporters don't think that they are biased in the same way that fish don't know that they're wet. I mean, it's just part of the world that they live in. But and you would not have had the growth of conservative talk radio or other alternative media unless there had been a very strong sentiment that the media was not talking to them or was talking at them or had become hostile. So, I was on the air for 23 years, and quite frankly, I wouldn't have been there if everybody would have thought that the media had been even-handed. Now, having said everything there, and I've experienced this on both sides, trust me. I mean, I have stories, we could spend the whole time talking about this. But I had an experience in 2016 that really encapsulated, I think, part of the problem with the media. For years, conservatives had been critiquing the bias of the liberal media, and there was always enough material there for them to do this. But and so for years, people would send me things, bogus stories, fake news, etc., and I would be able to push back and say, well, that's not true. Here's the story in the New York Times pointing it out. Here's what NBC writes about this, or NPR. And people would say, hey, good, I'm glad. I don't want to, believe false things. But, throughout 2016, I noticed it was changing, that you couldn't push back on the fake stuff. And it finally hit me that we had been so successful in critiquing the media that we had succeeded in destroying the credibility of fact-based media. And so it's one thing to say, let's criticize the bias because we want the media to be better. It's something else to say, let's destroy the media, or let's destroy the structures of truth. And I think that's where we're at right here. Donald Trump doesn't just troll the media. He is a chronic, committed liar. And as people like Gary Kasparov, the former chess master, has said, the point of lying and propaganda is not to convince you that something is true. It's to make you doubt your critical sensibilities, to say, I don't know who to believe. I don't know what to believe. This is the annihilation of truth. So that what we have now is, at the same time that you have some of the very best journalism of my lifetime being practiced. And you are seeing, I think the media actually is doing some amazing things. This New York Times piece on Trump's taxes is an amazing piece of journalism. The Washington Post stories about the administration are amazing works of journalism. But you have 40 or 45% of the country that either never sees them or won't believe them. And we've created these alternative reality silos in which half the country has a completely different set of facts. So I don't know how you get beyond that. And of course, what makes it all worse, and I know we don't have time to get into this, are the social media companies, the Facebooks of the world that have the algorithms that are more likely to push you to the fake news than to the real news. So it's the best of times and the worst of times, but it really is a challenge to our democracy when we no longer have a shared universe, and it's a very significant challenge for the media.
You know, that's an important point about social media, and myself, you, Charlie, we could all sit down one day and try to read a diverse range of media sources and still come away with our own bubble, because social media companies are pushing things based on an algorithm that you like to see. It's self-reinforcing, and that's just a reality. That's something that we're dealing with. Something that I hear a little bit now, and I hope it's kind of a sign that things are turning in the same way that maybe we've talked about some things in this conversation that were early signs of one thing or another, which is people will say to me, I don't just read this, or I try to do that. People are almost talking about the fact that they do try to get outside of their bubble. I think people are becoming more aware of the bubble. I hope that continues, and I think that's true whether you're a fan of Republicans or Democrats or the president or not, or anybody. I think we all have an interest in people getting information from a diverse range of places and caring about facts. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's something that Republicans and Democrats should disagree about. And I hear that sometimes. I hear people say, oh, I don't just read this, I'll also go read the Wall Street Journal. And maybe it's just me, maybe it's something I'm just encountering in my life, but I sure hope not. And I hope it's the beginning of, what we're really talking about today is a bunch of pendulums swinging on different axes. And if we're talking about the media pendulum right now and it's swinging one direction through no fault of, any one particular person, but as part of a larger systemic problem that we're all sort of suffering from, I don't know. Maybe that's a sign of the pendulum swinging back. Maybe that's naive. We'll see.
One of the questions that I've had is whether or not our politics are a pendulum where it always swings back, or whether it's a ratchet, which is like every time you take a step down or you destroy something, you've lost something and it gets worse. And so I guess I'm not quite as hopeful for it, because what I'm seeing is that people like to have their safe spaces. And I know that conservatives like to make fun of universities for safe spaces, but that's kind of the story of conservative media, that they want it to be a safe space, and they become less and less tolerant. And this is true, by the way, on some of the left media as well. They want to have their biases confirmed. They want to have that motivated reasoning backed up here. So I would like Brian to think that you are right about this. My sense is that the ratchet is moving down, and that everything that we're seeing now is getting worse. And we also have a roadmap of what the consequences for this are. You look at other countries where, you've had authoritarian, regimes. I'm not saying we're going to authoritarianism necessarily, but where democracy has split apart. This is the pattern. Hopefully we can reverse that. And as conservatives, we ought to be taking a lead in trying to reverse that sort of thing, because truth ought to be, I don't know, is that a partisan value? And look, I understand that politicians have always lied, and the Democrats have lied as well. But this whole culture now of, Trump lies on a chronic, consistent basis, but but judges or but tax cuts. I mean, there's an erosion here. So I wish I could be more optimistic.
There's also something to be said for what the president says, though, in terms of his supporters, and I don't think that they're just being fooled here. They feel that there's a candor from him, a willingness to sort of speak your mind, push back against cancel culture, which is something that Charlie kind of referenced there indirectly. And I do think that's important, and there are some lessons from the Trump era and from the president, frankly, whether people on the left or anybody else wants to learn them or not. And one of them is authenticity. Another is doing what you said you're going to do, which there are people who, when supporters of the president take a look at his record and they see the way that he has rebuilt the military, they see the way that he's taken on trade deals, they see the way that he has cut taxes. I mean, those are things he talked about. And he does a very effective job of speaking his mind. He does a very effective job of pointing out the big things that he said he was going to do that he's doing. And
like
that's
building the wall and having Mexico pay for it, eliminating the national debt. Two words that I would not apply to Donald Trump would be candor and authenticity. And come on, Brian, you know this. The guy is a chronic con man. You can support the politics. You don't have to buy into all the bullshit. I mean, this is the thing about Donald Trump. We know who he is. Don't turn it into a virtue, because Donald Trump, this whole notion that Donald Trump is authentic. Look, the man lies about everything and maybe goes, oh, okay, everybody's lying. But I'll tell you, we are in the midst, we haven't talked about this yet. I am pro-life. So I like the fact that the president is pro-life. But you know what? His policies on immigration, putting kids in cages, is not pro-life. And the way he's handling the coronavirus is not pro-life. And this is where the lies catch up with you. And this is where the willingness to mislead, to spin, to push out fake information is not just bad character or unconventional. It is costing lives on a regular basis. We are sitting here and more than 200,000 Americans have died. There's 1 million people who've died worldwide, but 200,000 Americans have died. It may be 300 to 400,000 by January 1st, in part because this president did not tell us the truth about this pandemic, continues not to tell us the truth about this pandemic, and is putting his own political interests ahead of him. So of all of the things I would say, look, Donald Trump has many strengths, but authenticity and candor are not among them. And we are paying this massive price. What will it take to have the reality check? What would happen if you had a president of the United States that lied about so many things and cost so many American lives? And what, we're going to sit here and go, yeah, the great thing about him is he's an honest guy. This is where I broke. I'm sorry. I can't. I wasn't able to go along with all of this stuff. You know, I'm not willing to sit here and, you know, look at a guy who's told 20,000 lies since he took office and go, think about that Donald Trump I like. He just tells it like it is. No, he doesn't. He tells it like what's in his interest, no matter who it hurts, no matter how much damage it does.
I guess I would just wonder, you know, what you think of the people who are good, decent, wholesome people out there who listen to him and feel that his message connected. I mean, there are a lot of really good people in what is considered flyover country in you know, most circles who hear what he has to say and feel that it resonates with them. I mean, are they just fools in your mind? I mean, these are people who have genuine beliefs upon whom a, you know, future movement will need to continue to be built. And, you know, it's...
Well, that's the crime. That's the immorality of it, that he's misleading people who trust him, because these are good people. And, you know, you mentioned before, I mean, I don't consider these people deplorable. I know these people. I'm a Wisconsinite. These are good and decent people. And I also know that this is where thought leadership comes into play. That these are people who would do the right thing, believe in truth, if, in fact, they are, you know, encouraged there. It's sort of like the two sides of every human being. We have so if we appeal to the better angels of their nature, these are going to be the salt of the earth. But if you plant these toxic ideas, if you tell them, you know, these Mexicans are coming and they're coming to rape your women and take your jobs, or you know what, you suburban housewives, if you don't vote for me, you know what the Democrats are going to do? They're going to have Cory Booker come to your town. You know, if people believe this, that's unfortunate. But ultimately, it's also poisonous. And that's why it's incumbent on us to say, okay, this isn't right. Brian, you want a conservative judge, that's fine. You want to pay less in taxes, that's okay. But at some point you go, hey, you know what? This kind of rhetoric is making America, it's turning Americans against one another. It's misleading people. In some cases, it's a matter of life and death. So, you know, it's like, this is the part that I find the most disillusioning, is that I get the transactional Republicans who need to say this stuff to keep their jobs. I get that. What I don't get are the people who feel the need to provide cover for all the rest of it, including the fact, I mean, okay, so let's leave these good, decent people from Watoma out of it. Brian, do you believe what President Trump says on a regular basis? Do you think he's honest? Do you think that he's likely to tell you the truth?
You know, I think that he says a lot of things that resonate with people for a real reason, and I disagree.
I didn't ask that. I asked what you believe.
Right.
And it resonate with you?
You know, I'm from a part of Wisconsin that didn't always feel like Mitt Romney necessarily reflected who I was, where I'm from, what my priorities are. And there is a refreshing element to a president who is willing to be unconventional and willing to take on as many sacred cows as the president has.
Give me an example. When he said that the Mexicans were going to pay for the wall, did you believe that?
I'm not sure what you mean. Like,
he said, we will build a wall and Mexico will pay for it. That resonated. Did you believe it?
I mean, the things that appealed to me about the candidacy were some of the more traditional values that you and I would agree with from the standpoint of taxes, rebuilding the military, those kinds of things. That wasn't really an issue that animated me.
Did you believe him? Was he being honest?
I don't know that because I don't know what's in it, where he's coming from on it. I can't speak to know what's inside anybody's heart any more than you can. I think that that was a campaign promise that was going to be a difficult one to attain. And that's not something that's new in our American politics. Now, the good news is that if we're trying to move forward from this, and we're trying to find a way to move forward from all of this, there's really no better place to do it than Wisconsin. Because the grassroots army that we have here, the supporters that we have here that built some of the success that we've had in Wisconsin in the past decade, which, by the way, I think you would probably still agree, I hope you would still agree, more conservative national reform and more conservative political leadership came out of this state than any other place in the country. So if we're looking for places and ways to move forward from here, I think that we have the best roadmap we possibly could here in Wisconsin.
Well, I think going, I guess, in line a bit with what we're talking about, I think when it comes to, the president's words and the weight of those words, and if he means what he says and says what he means, I mean, looking ahead to what will happen on Election Day with the transition of power and the rhetoric around that, I know that that's been cited for those in more right-wing media that it's the president kind of joking and trolling, but I mean, for either one of you, what are your thoughts about what we might, the power of those words when we're talking about the peaceful transition of power? And we're hearing rhetoric from both sides really about not wanting to accept the results of the election, but what's really the impact of that as we are heading into that in a few weeks?
Well, I think in some ways we've lost our capacity to be outraged about some of this when the President of the United States is asked directly, would you support the peaceful transfer of power? Will you go along with that? The answer is, of course, yes. That's what makes us a democracy. That's what makes us a constitutional republic, right? It's not a Democrat or Republican. We always have a peaceful transfer of power. But this is part of what bothers me so much. And I guess as a patriot, the willingness of the president to do this kind of damage to the legitimacy of the election, to tear us apart. In 1960, Richard Nixon could have contested his very narrow loss to John F. Kennedy, but he said, you know what, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to put the country through this. Al Gore in 2000 could have rallied the troops and said, we're not going to accept Bush v. Gore because I, should have won that election. He could have done that, but he didn't want to put the country through it. There was a certain graciousness and a willingness to put country ahead of personal ambition that you do not see from this president. And so I'm not one of those that believes that Donald Trump will not leave office if he loses the election. I'm not worried that they're going to have to take him out of the Oval Office. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that he's going to do long-term damage. He's going to convince tens of millions of Americans that this election was stolen. And I think that's going to do tremendous damage to this very fragile constitutional system that we have that we conservatives used to cherish so much. So I am worried about that. I am worried about how much what will happen in a divided country when you have the president not as a healer, but as a demagogue who is pouring kerosene on the fire, how long this might last after the election. And I'm hoping this may be the last off-ramp for the Republican Party, for Republicans to step up and tell the president it is time to go. You can't do this to the country. And I'm hoping that there will be someone who will play the role that Barry Goldwater played with Richard Nixon, saying that, okay, Mr. President, we may agree with you on policy, but you cannot do this to the country. It's your time.
Well, I think, Chuck Grassley said it best about this issue in his pushback, because there was pushback from Republicans, even if they don't get enough credit for it in the media. He said it really doesn't matter what the president or anybody says, it's in the Constitution, and that's true. And I think that's important, and it is important. I mean, the election, the integrity of our election is the most sacred thing in this country. No question about that, and I think we can all agree on that. And I also think that At the same time, while that is true, and that's an unassailable fact, and it's something that everybody on all ends of the political spectrum should agree with and support, and I think will support when the election is over, it's also true that people have heard time and time and time again that democracy is dying. And the fact of the matter is that we still have a Republican administration that's obeying orders by the Supreme Court. We still have a Republican administration that is tangling with a free press that is as free and wild and rowdy as maybe we've seen in a very long time in this country, which I think is a good thing. And we still have a president who is out there trying to earn the votes of people, right? I mean, these are hallmarks of democracy. People don't talk about them. They think it's, but these are real things. This is a big system. I'm maybe a little bit more optimistic about the strength of our system. I think that both sides, Republican and Democrat, have put strains on it. And I think, America is more durable than people give it credit for. It is absolutely something that we should cherish and we should guard. I agree. It's not something to take for granted. But it's a pretty good system of government that the framers came up with, and it is pretty durable. And I think we continue to see democracy working today, not dying.
Kind of in line with that, I had wanted to ask, we do see, and we touched on this briefly earlier, but just though, in light of the strength of democracy and the republic we have, I mean, really in some ways does rely on one party cooperating with another to actually get stuff done. And so how does Republican government function when we do see now one party largely refusing to cooperate? We've seen that to some extent in Wisconsin with the legislature and Governor Evers, and then harkens back to 2008 when Mitch McConnell, said that it was his goal to make Obama a failed president. And I understand, of course, the policy differences that exist there too, but I mean, how does the republic endure and continue and strengthen when we don't see any cooperation there, or little of it?
I don't think it's true now, and I don't think it was true in the Obama era that there was just one party that didn't want to work with the other. It always takes two to tango. I worked on Capitol Hill during not all, but some of the Obama years, and I can tell you that their congressional outreach was abysmal. I'm sure Charlie would probably agree with that. And it started before I was there, all the way back to the stimulus, when they had the chance to incorporate Republican ideas in terms of some of the way to structure some of the middle class tax cuts, and they didn't. I mean, they had supermajorities and they just crammed everything through. And it endured on into when I was in Capitol Hill. I mean, there really wasn't any engagement. It's unfortunate. So I think it takes two to tango. McConnell is always cited for that quote where he says we're going to make Obama a one-term president. What he said is we're going to make him a one-term president unless he does a Clintonian backflip. And what he's talking about there is unless this president changes his tune and shows that he wants to try to work with us. And so there's always room for both sides to build that opportunity, and there's always room for both sides to tear that down. Unfortunately, it's a lot harder to build than it is to tear down. It's knocked down in an instant, and it's built over many years. So it is a very difficult thing. There's no question about that.
Well, I mean, we're living through this right now. I mean, just take as one example. Everyone assumed that, of course, Congress would pass some sort of a coronavirus relief bill before the election, right? They would find some way to put their differences aside and pass that. They're not able to do this, which tells me that we're in a period right now of complete gridlock. We've used that term before. And in part, it is because of this sort of, winner take all, I win, you lose mindset that sees cooperation as something that is negative. And I think that to the extent that if both political parties adopt that as their model, we're in trouble. But I pay a lot more attention to the Republican Party, I will admit, than the Democratic Party. And this has become a mantra now, that we don't cooperate, that we just push through whatever we want. And I think that is dangerous, because you think of the major accomplishments of both political parties, whether both Democrats and Republicans, they were done on a bipartisan basis. And it's kind of hard to imagine that moment coming back. Remember, Social Security and Medicare, in different decades, obviously, both were passed overwhelmingly with Republicans and Democrats. It's kind of funny thinking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I know this wasn't exactly what you asked, but she was confirmed. I don't know, Katelyn, whether you know the number, but I think she got more than 90 votes in the Senate to confirm her, right? There was a time, in a very recent memory, when a Supreme Court justice did not divide us so violently from one another, and we're about to go into the hyper-partisan era. So somehow we have to step back from that. I don't know how. And I'm not looking for short-term leadership, unfortunately, from the Republican Party, certainly not as long as Donald Trump is in office. And by the way, Brian's right. But, you can really criticize Obama for bad congressional outreach. But think about what we have now. We have Donald Trump who just insults members of the Senate, browbeats them into compliance. And I think the one thing has to happen is for members of Congress to stand up and say, hey, we are not potted plants here. We are not rubber stamps. We're, Mr. President, we were elected too. We don't have to simply fall into line. And that's been another one of the tragedies, I think, watching what's happened to the Republican Party in Congress. I wish my friend Paul Ryan would have stood up more strongly. But at least he made some efforts before essentially going along with it. But think about that you could have had an independent Republican Party in Congress that might have pushed through these conservative ideas and policies without buying into all of the toxic stuff. And I don't know whether that's possible. I think that's an interesting question. Do you have to make the Faustian bargain in order to get the tax cuts and the regulatory cuts of the judges? Do you have to go along with all the lies? Do you have to pretend that the president is authentic? Do you have to go along with the racism and the lies about the border and the corruption and the backdoor dealings with Russia, et cetera? Maybe that was the price. But I'd like to think that there's an alternative reality in which Republicans would say, okay, Mr. President, you're going to get this, but you're not going to get everything. And unfortunately, and by the way, in Wisconsin, I really did think after 2016, if you would have asked me what's going to happen, I would say Wisconsinites are going to be independent. Our senators are independent. We have members of Congress who aren't simply just going to roll over and give Donald Trump what he wants. And I really expected that. And as you know, that's not the way it turned out.
So we don't have really any more time left, but I wanted to ask you, Charlie, another question. So this will be our last one, and Brian can respond to this too, because at the risk of getting too in the weeds here, this was a uniquely Wisconsin saga that drew out, but got national attention. And so, Charlie, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, particularly because we see some criticisms of the Republican Party in the way that Trump's presidency has diminished institutions like the Department of Justice and everything that's gone on with the Mueller report. So I'm curious how you compare the reaction of the GOP to the investigation of Scott Walker and the John Doe here in Wisconsin, which you were commenting on at the time, to the Mueller probe into Russian interference in the 2016 election. You've lamented that the GOP has been in denial and worked to impede holding Trump accountable. Do you think that the attack dog mode on law enforcement and the integrity of, the professionals there who worked on that was a warm-up to what we've seen now with the FBI?
No. And I thought you were going to ask that question because you told me you were going to. Look, I think I was very critical of that investigation. And I think it's legitimate to hold prosecutors accountable, just like it is appropriate to hold police officers accountable. I don't think we should ever take the position that all cops are always right, whatever they do, or take the position that all investigators are right, whatever they do, particularly if it's on a partisan political basis. But comparing the Wisconsin investigation to the Mueller investigations, like comparing my plastic kayak to an aircraft carrier, because one is a campaign finance violation, the other involves the fundamental integrity of our democracy, the Russian attempt to undermine the American election. So, and I think what's important is not to normalize what we're dealing with here. That this investigation and the things that Donald Trump has been accused of doing are not just business as usual, that this is way off the charts. And it's funny that you mentioned this because I'm reading Andrew Weissman's new book about inside the Mueller investigation. And he talks about how thoroughly they documented the contacts between the Trump campaign and the Russians. It did not rise to the level of bringing criminal charges, but they also powerfully were able to show the way that the president obstructed justice. And he makes it very clear that this president obstructed justice. So I understand there's always the temptation to say, well, but isn't this like this? But Donald Trump is not like other presidents we've had, And some of these investigations raise issues and stakes that we have not encountered before.
Your thoughts on that, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that the investigations are very different. I mean, they're different subject matter, they're different scale, and so it's difficult to make those comparisons. I do think that, I do want to rewind the tape just a little bit here, and this is relevant to your question, but it's not exactly what you're asking about, and then I'll circle back around, which is, I do think that one of the ways in which the media has unfortunately given people an inaccurate picture is the degree to which, I mean, everything is about conflict, as it, understandably so. And a lot of stuff is covered so breathlessly. But depending upon, which day it is, the media is either writing about Republicans as though they're in complete lockstep with President Trump and don't dare disagree, or there's a time where Republicans are disagreeing and pushing back, and suddenly these Republicans are, waging the great schism that's going to finally, make Republicans go the way of the Whigs. And both can't be true. And when those things are reported in the moment, they're reported like it's the only truth at that moment. The reality is that whether it's the Syria withdrawal or other types of things, there are certainly times where Republicans have disagreed with the president and pushed back, and where Wisconsin Republicans have done that too. So I think that's an important thing. I think that a lot of people who maybe don't necessarily like everything the president says, which, myself and, all Republicans and conservatives have to have had examples like that, like you would with anybody else. Those people also decide, I'm not just going to focus on what he says, but I'm going to focus on what he does, and some of those things are important. I've kind of talked about that. But circling back to the issue of the investigations, I think that one of the biggest takeaways that is a similarity between the two investigations, and I agree with Charlie that I would not create parallels, is the degree to which the Democrats have gone to lengths to utilize the resources at their disposal. And frankly, I think that one of the things that's out there that is really a true thing is, you talk about the deep state, and that's like immediately discredited, but there are large bureaucracies in the federal government as well as in the state government, and I think Charlie probably witnessed this during the Walker era, large bureaucracies of people who are of government, who prefer to not have a Republican overseeing that government because they don't want funding decreased, or they don't want it changed or reformed, or whatever it is, whether it's union driven or whatever it is. There are large masses of people who are often against Republican and conservative leadership at the top. And I think that's something that we've seen play out on the federal level, and I think that's something that we saw play out on the state level too.
Yeah, Robert Mueller was a Republican, though, and he served under a Republican attorney general. I just want to point that out.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, and I would agree. I think, of course, the scale is quite different and the subject matter was different. And I think the thing I was hitting on more as far as commonalities I've seen is just criticisms to hitting at like the lack of professionalism of law enforcement, or the very integrity of how they're doing their jobs in both cases, that, they both were political witch hunts. And so I understand, of course, the optics they're given that in Milwaukee County, of course, the DA there's a Democrat. But anyway, that was more kind of the line, the common line that I saw. Are there any last words or things that we did not touch on that either of you would like to say before we sign off?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that Wisconsin remains an example of what conservatism can be. Our recent history does, and I think that it can continue to represent what the future can be as well.
Wisconsin, and by the way, this is what I believed up until 2016 very, very strongly. I was a big advocate for the distinctiveness of the Wisconsin conservative movement. I think that Wisconsin is also emblematic of what's happened to the Republican Party, where you have seen these independent figures, whether you're talking about Reince Priebus or Paul Ryan or Ron Johnson or Scott Walker, decide that they're going to go all in on this Trumpian approach. They could have been an alternative conservative voice within the Republican Party. Instead, they've decided to go all in supporting this president. And even if it's just on the policies, I mean, when I say all in, I mean all in, defending everything, running interference. And I think that's also part of the story of what's happened to the Republican Party here. And that's why I mentioned that whole Michelle Malkin bringing in one of the most notorious white racists in the country to a major Republican event. This was an event that Paul Ryan spoke at a few years ago. So you've gone from Paul Ryan to an alt-right Holocaust denier. And at some point, Republicans in Wisconsin have to ask, what the hell happened to us?
Well, I think Wisconsin Republicans and conservatism are still exceptional. I agree with 2015 Charlie Sykes, and I wish he still agreed with himself.
I do agree with myself. That's the problem. I haven't changed what I've been thinking about it. I've watched the party adapt itself to something that would have been unthinkable. Because remember, in 2016, I was not the outlier. During that primary, Paul Ryan was on my show, Ron Johnson was on my show, and Scott Walker actually announced his endorsement against Donald Trump on my show. All of them understood what the stakes were, but they decided to compromise, and I didn't compromise. So, Brian, I'm not the one who did the flip-flop.
Brian, I'm wondering, and I know we have to go here soon, but are there specific examples of Wisconsin exceptionalism that you can point to that would be good to give folks, as far as what either it comes to our congressional delegation, where they've really stood up and been exceptional as far as the party's concerned, or any other types of policies?
Yeah, and I think that Charlie and I would probably agree on a lot of these. I think it's pretty extraordinary to have had, the most consequential governor in the country, Scott Walker, to have the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, and to have the White House Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus, all come out of one political movement. I think that regardless, stepping back from that, I think it's really important to recognize the exceptionalism from a policy standpoint. Wisconsin isn't the only place that Act 10 was enacted. It was enacted in various ways in various forms elsewhere, but that was an example of the conservative movement really rejecting one of the false choices that frankly has freed up local schools and local governments to make the kind of decisions that they need to make. To put more money into classrooms, to change and reform local government. And so I think that there's a lot of examples like that. Another one is school choice. I mean, this goes way back, but pioneering what happened in Milwaukee and giving families in inner cities choices and places to go. I mean, there's a lot of examples of Wisconsin conservatism putting forward ideas or growing their movement in a way that not only made a big difference here, but also offered a model for the nation. And I think that's something that we'd probably agree with on some grounds.
All right.
Well, that was then. I guess the question is, where are they now? What's happened? Because Brian's right. There was a moment where you had, Scott Walker was running for president. Reince Priebus was chief of staff to the president of the United States. Paul Ryan was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And yet this Republican Party has basically shoved them all to the side. That's the reality going forward. 2018 actually happened, and 2016 is about to happen. So yeah, there were some very considerable successes, but that's been this Trumpian tsunami that seems to have wiped away so much.
All right, well, we will leave it there. Thank you both so much for joining us, and thank you for watching.
Cap Times Idea Fest 2020 is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors. Presenting sponsor, the Burrish Group at UBS, a financial services firm with global access and a local focus to pursue what matters most for its clients. Major sponsors are HealthX Ventures, backing entrepreneurs who are creating value with digital health solutions. Exact Sciences, pursuing earlier detections and life-changing answers in the fight against cancer. Quartz, health plans built with you in mind. And Madison Gas and Electric, your community energy company whose goal is net zero carbon electricity by 2050. Co-sponsors are Epic Systems and the Godfrey Kahn Law Firm. Other sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Home Savings Bank, Unity Point Health Meritor, Cargo Coffee, and the Forward Theater Company. Media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal and Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Please consider becoming a Cap Times member. Learn more at membership.captimes.com.